Here's some things that I do to slow down the aging process as a 14-year-old. I started doing most of these things at 12.
Sephora kids are taking over the anti-aging industry, a market so young that rewinding 10 years would turn them into actual fetuses. TikTok routines like the morning shed are putting my sad little two-step skincare routine to shame, and Hollywood still treats women like they expire after a single wrinkle. Armed with 20-step skincare routines, Gen Z is waging a war on aging. But what is it about growing older in a woman's body that feels so terrifying? Today we're talking about ageism. Now, you might be thinking, Charlie, this one's a little out of your zone. Like, you're 25, you've just done a video on the quarter life crisis. I feel like ageism's a bit of a stretch. If that's what you're thinking, I do actually totally agree with you. I'm not really talking about it from that perspective though. I am fascinated by the fact that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are clearly petrified of aging. We've got children flooding Sephora, buying drunk elephant peptides and retinol serums, which are terrible for their faces and skin, but they've been sold into this idea that aging and anti-aging equals wellness and health. Then you've got Millie Bobby Brown, who was recently berated on social media for the fact that she looked far older, apparently, than she really is.
I started in the industry when I was 10 years old. I grew up in front of the world, and for some reason, people can't seem to grow up with me. Instead, they act like I'm supposed to stay frozen in time, like I should still look the way I did on Stranger Things Season 1. And because I don't, I'm now a target.
And I think this is a particularly interesting phenomenon, noting that Gen Z and Gen Alpha literally grew up on social media. We're the most knowledgeable and understanding of the fact that social media is completely fake. We understand that the influencers that we love are probably editing majority of their photos and content. We understand that Instagram's a highlight reel, all those cliches, and yet we're the first to put our hands up for this anti-aging skincare routine. We're the first to put our hands up for baby botox. We're the first to buy into this idea that anti-aging is foremost a preventative method rather than a corrective method. This pivot in thinking, this emphasis among Gen Z on anti-aging becomes really, really interesting when it has this moral tone to it as well. So often in society, we see that women are considered to have let themselves go when they decide to just go down the natural aging process, whereas women who age using things like Botox and having work done, in cases where it looks really fantastic and they have a good surgeon, we view them as morally superior. I want to unpack what this obsession with anti-aging means for our culture right now and why women can't just age naturally, why that's considered radical. Let's dive in. From the Diving Board is a show hosted by me, Charlie Chats, dedicated to decoding digital culture by unpacking the hidden politics behind the screen. The affection of a Virgo, which signs I consider women I think the most overt place where ageism is apparent and the place where it's most obviously spoken about is Hollywood. Hollywood's typically the place where men age like fine wine and women lose their jobs when they're 40 years old. Now, this is a reality that many actresses have openly spoken about. I was recently listening actually to the Call Her Daddy episode with Lauren Graham, who's Lorelai Gilmore in Gilmore Girls. I don't often listen to Call Her Daddy, but I have such a soft spot for Gilmore Girls, as you're probably aware if you've watched some of my other videos. Anyway, she was talking about the fact that when she first got the role, she was actually advised not to take the role of Lorelai Gilmore because it would be playing Rory Gilmore's mother. And it's a widely known fact in the industry that as soon as you play a mother, your career drops off. This was despite the fact she was literally in her early 30s at the time. Gina Davis has also spoken about this. She was told she was too old for a role where she was literally playing opposite a man 20 years her senior. It's actually ridiculous. It's so infuriating. The point here being, though, it's not anecdotal. It's very much systemic in Hollywood. Hollywood often sets the expectations around the women that we see in media and then the expectations that trickle down into society. Hollywood, and especially within the genre of horror actually, has a very long-standing tradition of portraying older women as grotesque rather than wise or complex. If you think back to to the 60s, the film Whatever Happened to Baby Jane is a classic example of hagsploitation, a subgenre where basically older women are cast as the antagonist, the villain, because we hate to see a powerful older woman. As Billy Walker put it in an article for Refinery 29, how are women ever going to come to terms with the inevitability of aging when the only representation of our older bodies are used to horrify? We rarely see older women's bodies on screen, and when we do, they are intended to horrify. They're intended to shock. They're literally put in horror films as like the scary jump scare. Like, that is actually insane. I'm thinking of the scene in The Shining as well, and there are so many other depictions of it. I'm obviously not going to put these naked images on screen for many reasons. The subtext being of this, though, is that an older woman's body is grotesque rather than natural, beautiful, just normal. This is even more accentuated when horror films depict these older women as being sexual. That's considered this added layer of horror and shock value, something to apparently be uncomfortable by, because an older woman who's past their age of fertility being a sexual being is something that is apparently not accepted within our society. Okay, from a purely biological perspective, maybe this makes sense, but I think there's a little bit more to unpack here. Culturally, we're pretty comfortable seeing women as symbols for life. I mean, think of goddesses of fertility, the Virgin Mary, Mother Earth. There are so many examples in mythology and religion. Aging and the depiction of aging, the imagery of aging is in stark contrast with this. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that as a society, we do feel uncomfortable by women who age. It seems to be almost the opposite of life, and it's a reminder perhaps of our own mortality. These stereotypes about what it means to become an older woman is very much within our media, in our films, in our advertising, and it very much feeds into our fears about what it means to grow older in a woman's body. Now, our fears about mortality is one thing, and it's something that a lot of people struggle with. It dictates so many of our decisions in our lives. It contributes to a lot of anxiety and depression. It is a huge unknown, and it's been written about at length by philosophers and authors and people who write novels about weird fairies that are immortal, parking that there. It's definitely a concept that humanity is kind of obsessed with. Places like social media and Hollywood only just hyperbolize and exaggerate these fears about mortality and aging. And I mean, it kind of makes sense that a society so terrified of women's aging would have and reinforce algorithms on TikTok that promote youthful beauty, that promote ageless, timeless filters, that encourage these types of beauty standards and behaviors, and that sideline older women on the app. Now, I mean, the conversation around TikTok filters and social media and the way that the beauty filter just evens out all flaws and perfection, they're kind of tired and overdone. I don't really want to get into it, but I do think it's interesting to note and important to note, because these are the things that are informing our expectations about what it looks like to age and what it means to age. So it's actually no wonder that 10-year-olds are flooding Sephora.
There's some things that I do to slow down the aging process as a 14-year-old. I started doing most of these things at 12.
I'm the first person to put my hand up and be like, that is not normal that children are buying 20-step skincare routines, but can I really complain and throw out these narcissistic allegations as someone who kind of was part of that? All of Gen Z, all millennials, had a hand in creating these unrealistic beauty standards and reinforcing them on the apps. And I'm not saying that was completely done by us. Advertising, the beauty industry, celebrities, the Kardashians, these are all people that have very much had a powerful part to play. But we've all fed into this as well. And we've all reinforced it by the ways that we interact with the app. And so I do think sometimes when we're so weirded out by Gen Alpha in particular, I think it's because they reflect back to us what we have created and the culture we've created and fostered on social media. And it's unsettling to see that among children. And it's really unsettling to see children care so much about the way they look and the way that they're going to look in future, and to put so much effort into trying to prevent aging when they've barely even hit puberty. To bring it back to these children using anti-aging products, I can't completely blame us as users, because the beauty industry, they just doubled down. Have you noticed the way that anti-aging products used to very much be corrective? The way that their packaging was this kind of ugly, I'm picturing this ugly metallic bottle that's behind like a plastic screen, like a lockbox in Coles. Such a niche reference. I'm sure there will be a few of you that get it, but it's definitely not the pastel pinks and greens that Drunk Elephant has jumped onto. And then when you think about the fact that the way that these products are being framed is not so much in an anti-aging way, it's in a health and wellness way. Every morning routine you can possibly think of involves some kind of multi-step skincare routine, and often some of these peptides and retinol that's supposed to prevent aging is being packaged as something you should do for your own wellness, for your own health. I'm jumping in here from a different location because I found this absolutely epic quote about the amount of money and just the life-sucking ability of the beauty industry and the anti-aging industry specifically to take from women. And I think that I have clearly emphasized it a lot, but I really wanted to drill in the point. These beauty industries are here to make billions and billions of dollars from us. If they can capture us as younger consumers, if they can capture us as Sephora kids, as 10-year-olds, they have got people sucked in their web for life, feeding into their own billionairedom. I basically based this little section on an article written by Emily Stewart for Vox called How the Anti-Aging Industry Turns You into a Customer for Life. And I'm going to quote it to you. According to data from Euromonitor International, the anti-aging market grew from $3.9 billion in 2016 to $4.9 billion in 2021 in the United States alone. The global anti-aging market went from $25 billion to nearly $37 billion US dollars in the same period. As Amanda Hess outlined in New York Times Magazine in 2017, it's no longer so much packaged as hiding wrinkles, but instead is cloaked in language about radiant, brighter, healthier looking skin. It's not about denying the passage of time, but defying it. You're supposed to feel empowered to look your best at any age. And interestingly, the article goes on to note that while older women are being pioneered as the face of the anti-aging industry, as the face of anti-aging in general, to try and bring this kind of narrative that we're now empowering older women and that we now value older women for their beauty, Emily Stewart writes that this is ultimately flawed when you note that a lot of these women have put significant effort into their skincare routines, into their surgeries, into their botox to make sure that they never actually look the age that they are. So this whole narrative of giving power to older women doesn't really work when the very industry that's putting that out to you is trying to cancel out any signs of aging ever, is terrified of aging, or is at least feeding off of your insecurities of being terrified of aging. And particularly, she notes that the ways that these women have accomplished these age-defying appearances is not accessible to most people, as in expensive procedures, products, and airbrushing. Not to mention, most of how you age has nothing to do with your face anyway. It's about exposure to the elements, hydration, drinking, smoking, genes, etc., etc. Companies know that, which is why they will always have another thing to sell you. And on that note, let's continue with the video. As a consequence of young people buying into preventative, anti-aging skincare routines and baby Botox, it feeds into these deep-seated, pre-existing fears around what it means to age. And studies have shown that Gen Z is actually more fearful of aging than other generations ever were. In a social media world where the currency is visibility, desirability, attention, it's no wonder that aging is something that many young girls and women fear, because aging typically is associated with becoming invisible. And this is only accentuated for women of color and queer women and non-cis het white women, because beauty standards and conforming to beauty standards are all the more profound for people who don't exist within the majority. And I think this is really important to just note the intersectionality of this. I think another way to reinforce just how significant this fear is among Gen Z and younger populations, I was doing this research for another video. It was my sun tanning video, and it was about skin cancer. Now, there's a campaign in Australia called End the Trend, which is basically targeting younger people to really think about the way that they're putting on sunscreen to encourage more sunscreen use. The first statistic shown has nothing to do with death, has nothing to do with skin cancer. Instead, it reads, sun exposure accounts for 80% of visible aging. Now, I trust that the End the Trend campaign has an incredible team of market researchers who have deliberately put that there because they know that's going to get through to young people more so than talking about their literal potential fatality. I just watched back the video that I just made. And while I stood by everything I said, I was like, yep, so we just went from anti-aging products to the witch trials of the 1500s without any warning, without any link. And I was like, I'm thinking no one else is in my brain, and I'm thinking this makes no sense. Even to me, as I'm watching it back, I'm like, yeah, that was objectively so confusing. So I've decided to come in here and do a little cameo, and I want to clarify with this section what I'm actually getting at here. I think it's always good to start from the start with topics like this that are particularly nuanced, particularly when we're trying to link beauty with politics. And it's always good to just lay the groundwork. Like many other topics that I've spoken about on this channel, the devaluation of women when they don't conform to particular beauty standards is particularly apparent with ageism and aging. I want to unpack some of these terms that get thrown around a lot in feminist theory, like male gaze, internalized male gaze, because I think this is really, really relevant here in relation to ageism and the fact that we're so obsessed with youth. Defined by Laura Mulvey in her essay called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema of the 1970s, the male gaze originated in the context of film analysis. The male gaze refers to the presentation of women in film as the heterosexual object of a man's desire, whereas men are presented as fully formed, human, empowered. We understand their desires, their needs, their wants, etc. A woman's feelings, thoughts, and desires under the male gaze aren't considered important. In fact, her main presence often in the film is to be an object and to be sexualized. Woman is spectacle, while man is the bearer of the look. And as I mentioned earlier, older women are rarely even seen as sexual objects at all in film. Instead, they're seen as the villain or the antagonist, or they're just invisible altogether. Notably, also, many have argued that there isn't even such a thing as a female gaze, because when women are the center of the film, when women are the subject and we understand their desires, it doesn't reinforce the patriarchy. The thing about the male gaze is that it reinforces and exaggerates this gender imbalance where men have more power and women don't. And the thing about the female gaze is that when we do see women as fully formed characters in film, it just evens things out rather than further entrenches an existing imbalance. And so, in fact, a lot of film critics and a lot of people in this feminist space don't even say the term female gaze, they just call it the non-gaze. Now, this term has had significant traction in feminist theory, and you've probably heard of it before in the context of the internalized male gaze, which suggests that under patriarchy, it's impossible, like quite literally impossible, for women not to start perceiving themselves under this male gaze perception. The argument here is that because the male gaze defines the way that we perceive women so often in society and under patriarchy, that women are so often considered an object rather than a subject, that women are objectified in film, advertising, novels, etc., women have internalized this in their own minds. And the very famous quote, which kind of sparked this conversation, is from Margaret Atwood. I'm going to read it all out because it is such a profound quote, and I don't think you can read it too many times. Male fantasies, male fantasies. Is everything run by male fantasies? Even pretending you aren't catering to male fantasies is a male fantasy. Pretending you're unseen, pretending you have a life of your own, that you can wash your feet and comb your hair, unconscious of the ever-present watcher peering through a keyhole in your own head, if nowhere else. You are a woman with a man inside watching a woman. You are your own voyeur. It's why so many of us put on makeup in the morning even if we're not going to see anyone. I do it all the time and I'm literally a victim. I literally am the first person to be like, it feels good. I like the routine. I like the structure. It gets me up in the morning. But I can guarantee if we didn't have these patriarchal male gaze beauty standards in our society, putting on random stuff on your face would not be something that you would do. Like, you wouldn't worry about this kind of thing. In fact, it's literally objectively inconvenient and annoying, and it takes time out of my day where I could be using my energy and mind somewhere else. And to clarify, this doesn't apply obviously to when you wear makeup for a creative purpose or an artistic purpose or a performative purpose. I think that's a separate thing, and makeup is definitely not always male gazy. This is also why those TikToks that kind of portray women dressing for the male gaze versus women dressing for the female gaze kind of miss the point, because the whole idea is that no one can escape the male gaze within a patriarchy. And there's amazing discourse on this, by the way, which I don't really have the time to go into, particularly in the queer community, about whether or not queer women escape the male gaze. And it's also a known fact that the male gaze and male gaze beauty standards are inherently youthful. You've probably seen those really, really disconcerting graphs where it shows as women age, their attraction to men also grows in age. So like a 45-year-old will find a 45-year-old attractive, that kind of thing, versus as men age, the age that they find attractive in women stays relatively the same and never really exceeds the age of 25. Really, really disconcerting, right? And now I think a lot of people will say, yeah, but that's biology, that's evolution, this is all based on biology. But the thing is, biology doesn't produce all social norms. Biology doesn't produce what we find attractive in all senses. Sociology has a lot to do with it. Culture, politics has a lot to do with our perception of what's attractive. And in fact, a really interesting study that I found, which was done in Korea, suggested that infant mortality is actually increased when the mother is under the age of 29 and over the age of 40, which suggests that a woman's most fertile period is perhaps between the ages of 29 and 40. If that was the case, then this attraction to women in their early 20s doesn't necessarily make sense from an evolutionary perspective. And yet, despite this, there's still a huge emphasis in society around youthfulness and fertility. Our society clearly values women when they're younger and devalues women when they're older. So many women report feeling invisible and not worthy when they're older. So many women report feeling that they're no longer the object of the male gaze, whether they mean that positively or negatively. We clearly care a lot about the fact that we're no longer valued after a certain age, and we clearly care a lot about our youthfulness and preserving our youthfulness. We convince ourselves that this is something that we want in the name of health, wellness, whatever it may be. The internalized male gaze is particularly profound when it comes to aging. But why would we as a society still be so obsessed with women's youthfulness and potentially their fertility if it has nothing to do with evolution or biology? What kind of social norms shape these desires, and why do we have them at all? And knowing me, if you've seen some of my videos, you might not be too shocked what's about to come out of my mouth, but I think this might have a lot to do with the fact that we're currently living through a period of a rise in conservatism. And particularly when conservatism is on the rise and the far right is on the rise, gender norms and gender values become particularly profound, with traditional gender essentialist norms suggesting that women's roles in society are for their reproductive capacity. The fact that women should be caregivers, mothers, homemakers. We've seen it in the tradwife content that we're seeing online, but we've also seen it in US politics, which are banning abortion, access to contraceptive methods. The list goes on. Women's bodily autonomy typically does decrease when we enter times and periods of conservatism, far right, and fascism values being upheld within our culture and society. Under this lens, perhaps fertility is not only desirable based on biology or evolution, but based on an economic capitalistic notion of success. Now, to unpack this point, I did take a little deep dive into various periods in history where women's reproductivity was highly valued, and the value placed on women was particularly heightened when they were more fertile. And here's where the witch trials did come in. Look, we came full circle. I told you we were going to get there. I just needed to sew the threads together. Silvia Federici has written at lengths about this, about the notion that the witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries were heavily about the economic expansion in Europe, because many economists at the time believed that in order for an economy to grow, it required population growth. And obviously the implied message here is that women need to be foremost the reproductive vessels in this situation. Their role in society is to have children. This was initially implied, and then it was very much explicit. Jean Baudin is a very famous economist at the time. His works basically were the foundation for mercantilism, which is the idea that exports are going to grow an economy, but also population growth is too. And he explicitly said in his famous best-selling novel, which was called The Demon Mania of Witches, that women were required to basically have children. That was their only requirement, and that any woman who didn't engage in this, any woman who was unable to pass their fertile age, any woman who had any disabilities, who facilitated abortions, who had an abortion, could be accused of witchcraft. He very much advocated for worse ways of torturing women at the time and the systemic femicide that occurred as a result. I think it's interesting that this, although not apparent in terms of the witchcraft allegations anymore, thank God, because I would so be a witch. This setup here, it's giving Jean Baudin will have me killed. I would be outed in his book. I would not be here anymore. So thank God I wasn't living in that time. And also, not to make a mockery of it, that was actually a horrific period that I feel like a lot of people don't take seriously.
No, but it's not funny. At the end of the day, is it? It's serious.
What this has resulted in is that these ideas laid the groundwork for modern day capitalism. The idea that women are foremost these reproductive vessels in society because they bring into our society potential taxpayers, labourers, and future productivity. Now, around the time of the pandemic, economists were deeply concerned with population growth, and I mean, rightfully so, that makes sense. In the face of a global pandemic wiping out populations without discrimination, it totally makes sense that economists were worried about population growth. But I think what was really interesting and was noted by Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett in her article for The Guardian was that so often it was men discussing the need for future labour forces, future taxpayers, future productivity, and so often women were completely left out of this conversation. The conversations being had really just skirted around the implicit idea here that women's role in society, if this theory is going to work, will be foremost mothers for the next foreseeable future if we want to focus heavily on population growth. To quote Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett directly for The Guardian, as economic panic about the birth rate continues, it's only natural to fear that women's reproductive autonomy will come under threat. The men are already talking about us as though we're not there. She continues and then uses fascist Italy as a really notable and poignant example of this. In the 1920s to 40s, Mussolini's Battle of Births was very heavily focused on women as being foremost reproductive vessels, and the idea that women really only had one role in society, and that was to have children. Women were literally punished if they didn't have children, if they were unfertile, if for whatever reason they didn't want to have children, or they just literally couldn't have children, and were heavily praised when they did. In fact, they literally got given awards. They got given medals. Men who had over 6 children were also given tax cuts, which is just so dystopian. It is so important to be aware of what's happened in history and how that will inform patterns that we see today. I think this is very much part of the reason why women who are depicted as youthful and younger and potentially fertile are more desirable in our society rather than older women. I think overtly, sure, it's a really bold and potentially crazy thing to say that a woman's only obligation currently in society is still viewed as having a child. I don't agree with that. However, I do think it's important to look at how we still treat women who don't have children and who choose to be child-free. And I think that kind of does suggest that we still do see it as, in some ways, a woman's obligation and moral duty to have a child. We still haven't completely wiped that ideology from our culture.
December, every sign has its own mode. I was in love with the Sagittarius. See the emotions he put me through.
So, after all that, would it be insane to suggest that perhaps our fear of aging is tied to our fear of no longer being valued by a society that places not only so much, say, biological or evolutionary value on women when they're younger and more fertile, but literally economic and capitalistic value on women at this age and era as well? Maybe it's crazy, or maybe it's really evident and obvious. And as a woman who hasn't experienced ageism yet, who hasn't even had a child, who hasn't even gotten to the age where people are expecting that of me, I can't make any conclusions on this topic, and I'm actually not going to in this video. And I mean, I don't often make conclusions anyway. I like to leave that up to you guys, and I like to take you along with me with my thinking patterns. And I also think it's realistic to not have conclusions. Like, so many of these topics that I do are so multifaceted, you almost can't have a strict one-way view. And I think it's really healthy to constantly come back to our opinions, to criticize what we once thought, and to not be so steadfast in the way we think about things, because our opinions can change. And I think that's really healthy, and it's really healthy to be open-minded. So I'm not making it a conclusion. That was a long-winded way of saying that. What I do want to say though is that while I can sit here and talk about the male gaze and talk about how shit the patriarchal beauty values are in our society and how it so often is tied to gender essentialist norms, I completely see the irony that I'm a very feminine presenting woman. I do my makeup before all of these videos. My hair's often done and out, and I care about the way I look from this male gaze perspective. The reason I raise this is because we can all feed into this, and we can all have these internalized male gaze views in our minds, as creepy as that sounds. We don't have to not play into it. I think that that is a really unhelpful piece of advice. If someone's like, yeah, just don't play into it, just do the opposite, just don't play into the male gaze value, because I know that the more you conform to these particular beauty standards, the more you conform to male gaze beauty standards, let's put it that way, the easier it's going to be for you as a woman to navigate through life. It just tends to be the case. And I think that's really accentuated among marginalized women and among women who exist at intersections of marginality and minority groups. And so to just say, oh, just don't conform, is like the most unhelpful piece of advice ever. I'm also not saying you should conform. I'm more bringing this to the forefront, bringing this to the conversation. I kind of just want to end by challenging you to center some older women in your life, whether that be reaching out to grandparents, speaking more with older people, with your parents, with your aunties, with older women in general. I challenge you to really value those interactions and really value those experiences, because it's just too frequent that we let older women become invisible. It does sound really, really silly to say this, but I really want to start diversifying my social media feed and following older women too, and seeing more older women as idols in fashion and in culture and what they have to say on my social media, because I want to create a feed, or curate a feed, that is more diverse. And I think that the only way that we're going to stop worrying so heavily about our own aging is when we start perceiving older women as really cool. I think that's the only way. And when we start to do that, we're not going to be so trapped. We're not going to be so in this consumerist web, which sucks all of our life and soul and money from us and allows us to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on anti-aging products that probably won't work. And once we embrace that, and once we think older people are cool, I think we're going to have a better time, and we're not going to be so worried about what the future looks like for us. And on that note, I'm going to see you guys in my next video. Absolutely would love to hear your thoughts on this video. This is a very interesting topic to me, and I really got thinking about this, which was really fun. I love when I think. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye.